the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 48. This week we're back with part 2 of what Terri has been listening to, or was listening to a little while ago. What have you got for us today, Terri?
Well, Daisy, it took me a bit to get back into it because I've listened to it so many times since you and I had some fits and starts about recording. So I apologize for listeners that this may be a little disjointed, but I think it's going to be okay because the first part of this was from an episode of the Model Health Show with Shawn Stevenson, and his guest was Caroline Leaf, and she's a neuroscientist that just has a wealth of information about the brain. And what we were talking about is the difference between the brain and the mind, and that when we are thinking and taking in information, she describes it as we're creating these little trees that get started. I think the biggest thing to think about in today's episode, or the part that I'm going to talk about today, is a little bit more about what to do about that. And her book is called Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, or Cleaning Up the Mental Mess. And it's the idea that we start a lot of these trees, and their presence interferes with the electromagnetic field in our brain. And so we want to prune them. We want to get rid of the unnecessary ones. We want the ones that are there to be a really lush green forest. And so this is what we're going to talk about today.
Now that's interesting, that we start too many. It sounds like me with just about everything I do. Mm-hmm. Start a million projects.
So the biggest point I think of her episode really is about what does it take to create behavior change, habit change, to change what we do, how we respond, create new habits. What we do, as I mentioned, is we create a lot of these little trees because we think about a lot of things, we gather a lot of data. And I think you and I are great examples of this. We're listening to all these podcasts, we're looking at all these articles and reading all these interesting things. But what tends to happen is we really just gather all that data, and it creates these little light green trees that are just interference. And so what we need to do is to be able to get rid of these and strengthen the ones that we're actually going to look at more in depth. So it is really about a deeper processing of information rather than just gathering tons of information. And she said something that was really interesting to me. And Shawn Stevenson, the guy who was interviewing her, has written a book about sleep. And she said that in actuality, one of the biggest causes of sleep difficulties is having too many of these little trees.
Makes sense.
Because our brain is just trying to process all of these things, and it has to go through and try and clean them out at night. So it's actually disruptive to our sleep. So learning new things and processing things more deeply is what really helps to grow more solid, lush trees, which we want. And doing this also helps increase our brain resilience. Our brain has more interference when it has a lot of these little trees, just excess. And so by really kind of, like I said, pruning and more deeply processing things, we're actually helping with our brain resilience. So one of the things she talked about, they geeked out for a minute talking about telomeres, which are kind of the ends of genes. And shorter telomeres are actually associated with our aging process. So we can kind of see the aging effect on our telomere length, and also tied to things like depression. And what they can find when they look at people's health, they can look at 35-year-olds who basically have the physical body of a 65-year-old based on the aging process, and their telomeres are very short. And by doing some of these strategies that she teaches, in just 9 weeks, they can start to see growth in their telomeres. So kind of almost like an anti-aging or reversing the aging process. So I think it's really important for all of us to think about having a lot of kind of mental mess actually is unhealthy for our brain and actually ages us. our brain also is not really wired for anger, jealousy, depression, anxiety. And so the idea of actually processing through rather than just trying to avoid these things, again, is very important to get solid trees instead of just all of these little saplings. Okay, so she talks about in her book and in this episode, she talks about a process that she refers to as brain building. And there are 5 steps to this. And she actually recommends that we should do this activity for about an hour to 2 hours per day.
Wow.
To really strengthen our brain and build the processes. And in the process of starting something new, she said that most likely, most of us will not feel any change within the first 3 weeks. It's those first 21 days where we are going through and kind of rooting out the little green trees that aren't really going to be nurtured, getting rid of those and really starting to solidify and foster the roots of the ones that we want to take hold. So that's where the neuroplasticity comes in. It's in those first 21 days where we're setting up that pathway. And then she describes that the process actually takes 66 days because 21 days, as I said, is to get it really kind of rooted. And then the 42 days is to reinforce it until it becomes unconscious process rather than something we have to be conscious of. So she calls this the neurocycle, these 5 steps, and she actually has an app. I downloaded the app several weeks ago. I was getting ready to really dig into it and then have kind of been taken away from that for a couple weeks. So I can't reflect on that a lot, but there is an app called the Neurocycle, and it's really designed to help us learn to manage our mind to help build a more effective brain. And then here are the steps. So the first thing we're going to do, even before the steps really, she talks about is preparing or priming the brain. And you can do things like breath work, tapping, anything that kind of calms your neuro system. And one of the breathing strategies that she talked about, she describes it as the 10-second pause. It's a breath process where you inhale to the count of 3, and then you exhale to the count of 7. So they're 10 seconds per breath. And on the inhale, for the 3 seconds, she encourages you to think or even say the words, think, feel. Because these are the processes that we're doing. Think, feel. And then on the exhalation, the word choose. And that kind of, I think she may have referred to it as ocean breath, that she talked about. A lot of people in yoga are familiar with that it's kind of the pushing out breath. What happens in this exhalation part is that it forces more oxygen into the front of the brain. So it increases the blood flow in that area, therefore increases the alpha energy of the brain and the gamma waves. So there's more insightfulness. And this is really important in processing emotions and processing our behaviors, that we have this insightfulness. And she actually said that you can kind of tell when people aren't in this place, they really lack that insight. Everything is they can't kind of take it in and see their own role in things. And she described doing that for maybe 60 seconds, doing 6 to 9 of those repetitions, just to kind of prepare your brain for the neurocycle. The first step of the neurocycle then is to gather awareness. And she's very clear about these words she uses. It's not just to be aware, but it's to gather awareness. And she uses an analogy of you're sitting under an apple tree. Now, the apples might be falling on your head, which kind of hurts, but, gathering the apples and choosing which ones to gather and look at. So the first step is gathering. And she actually describes that it's helpful to think about which pieces to gather. Emotional cues, what's going on emotionally. Physical cues, what's happening in your body. And behavioral cues, what are you doing? So she gives an example, maybe you're having an argument in a important relationship. And you're saying really ridiculous things. That's okay. This is just gathering the awareness. Don't critique it or anything yet. Just see, okay, I'm saying some really nasty things right now, but really just gather awareness. The second step then is to reflect. And she really emphasizes this part as this is where we're going to really dig into that data that we have and start to make sense of it. So asking yourself, why do I think that? Why am I feeling that? Well, because of this, but why? And not in a critical, judgmental way, but just in that real curious, see how far down the path you can follow that question. So you're really trying to dig into to understand more. The third step is to write. She calls it a metacog. So you're just kind of spilling out everything onto paper, just kind of a word vomit, she says. And you're really just going to see the forest of writings. You're just going to see all of this, everything that you can put down. The fourth step then is to recheck. And that's where you go back and work on making sense of the writing. You might draw pictures, you might use colored markers, circle things, draw arrows. But then this is where you're just trying to make sense of any of this writing that you did.
So you're kind of repeating those. It's like step 1 and step 2. Step 1 is that kind of, you've got that sort of pruning thing going on. Step 2 is the more deeply processing. Step 3, is just spilling it all out. And then you're repeating this sort of pruning and going more deeply. It sounds like it's just a sort of a reinforcement of this 2-step process.
Absolutely. And in this process, kind of again, this is the neuroplasticity part. They find that we drop cortisol levels while doing this. We see a decrease in prolactin, another hormone. So it's affecting our brain chemistry by going through these steps. And she didn't go into as much detail in this episode as I think she probably does in the book. But this is very scientific. They really have, it's not some willy-nilly, hey, do this, then do this sounds good, do this next. But they really follow what happens in our brain and our body while we're doing these things. And then the fifth step is activate. It's kind of what will you do? So let's say, for example, when I feel this, I will wait 5 seconds before I say anything. When I feel this, I will take a deep breath. What are the action steps you're going to do with this information that you've been kind of digging through so that you can act differently, build the behavior? She also talks about this neurocycle. I think I mentioned last time, I also listened to her on an episode of Jim Kwik's podcast. And he very much is about teaching people things. And so she talked about you can use this same 5-step process in the learning process. So it's such a valuable process to be practicing.
I was going to say, it reminded me of that, actually. It reminded me of reading things, taking notes, going back over the notes and, drawing diagrams, getting the marker pens out. That's what I was thinking of, actually, when you were first talking about it.
And again, if you think about her whole tree analogy, when we don't do those steps, we are just cramming in more and more of those little tiny trees that just aren't very developed. And we're just kind of bogging down the system and clouding the system.
That's right. You have to do it. If you're using that, it's an easier way to think of it in a way of the learning process. And when you're revising for an exam, say, it's all about, isn't it, taking that information down into the simplest form that will then trigger the more information when you've got to write a great long essay in the exam or whatever. But you need those key parts that you've whittled it down to first. Makes a lot of sense.
She also talked about something I thought was interesting, that kind of the emotional processing, emotional things. We create like 1 million cells a second in our body. And if we are in a kind of bad emotional state, when we're building those, the chemical process that's going on in our body is going to affect how those cells are built.
Interesting.
I don't remember the term she used, but basically it's going to kind of cut their development short. And so she used the example of just like 1 minute of anger. If that's compromising our kind of cell production, if we create 1 million cells per second, 60 million kind of damaged cells we're creating during that time. And so that just also made me start to reflect on wanting to be more proactive about how I process things, not to go back to what you and I talked about just be positive about everything, but to really allow myself to process emotions so that they don't linger and fester and continue to affect the cells that I'm creating in my body. So it's a kind of a tangent of this conversation, but it was something that really just made me stop to think about wanting to learn how to use this information more.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So as I was thinking about this, and like I said, I've listened to it a number of times, and each time I listened, I picked up on some different things and thought about some different things. But again, it just really helped me to get to that place of realizing I tend to think about a lot and learn a lot at a very surface level. And I think that's not helping me. I think it's actually, like I said, kind of clogging up the system. And so I want to really start to be more conscious of learning and processing things, digging in, doing the deeper processing, and getting rid of the fluff of just too much stuff. So like I said, I have downloaded the app. So my intent is to start practicing with the app. I did listen to another talk she did, or the beginning of the app, and she talked about you want to choose one thing that you're struggling with or working on and go through the whole process, the 21 days to do the first part, and then the 42 additional days. The 42 days, really, it's kind of only doing the fifth step. So rather than doing steps 1 through 5, you're just doing step 5 each time. And it's really short. It's only like a minute or 2 each day. But you can't do the neurocycle on 10 different issues you're working on all at the same time.
I suppose that kind of defeats the object of what she's talking about, doesn't it?
Right.
Too many things. Yes, I was wondering about that actually when you were talking about the cycle and spending time on it every day. I was wondering then, is it, are you choosing a different thing that is important to you that day? So I see. So you're picking one topic, one thing that you're struggling with, or one thing that you want to change in particular. And that's the thing that you're focusing on, presumably probably coming at it from slightly different angles every time you work through the cycle. I guess it depends what spills out in that word vomit, etc. That's part of the reason you need to take the time over the 66 days.
Yeah. And I'm sure if we do a catch-up episode in a month or couple of months, I'll be able to come back and tell you more what I've learned in using the app.
So is it the app takes you through the steps, does it?
Yes.
Right.
And the other thing she talks about, some in this episode, again, I'm sure more so in the book and then in the app, these can be things like, let's just say, for example, when you're talking with people, you use a passive-aggressive response. So that might be the thing you work on. That's the behavior change, the habit that you're wanting to do differently. But it also could be you do this process on a childhood abuse example, that you have childhood abuse, trauma, sexual abuse, or something that's not really been processed, that you can process through that using these steps. And I think she said the kind of day-to-day ones you would do in a little shorter time. And then obviously the more significant ones you would spend more time on. But she's been able to do this with people who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, all kinds of different brain traumas, and get to see how they're able to kind of reconfigure and incorporate things differently. And again, even when she talks about people who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, she doesn't really see that as a disorder. She sees it as kind of a symptom of a disorganized brain, and that we can bring it back together.
I can see the logic of that, yeah.
Yeah, so from psychologically looking at depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, all of these things, she just really talks about them much more as they're signs of a system that's not working well. And I really liked that, how she doesn't pathologize. She doesn't, and I remember I talked about this in the first part of this, but not looking at it as a depressive person versus a person experiencing depression. It's a disorganization. It's a miswiring at that time.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I really want to read her book. It sounds like something that personally I would benefit from, as well as just she sounds like a really interesting person. And the trees analogy appeals to me as a gardener because visually, instantly, it makes sense to me. I can picture it. I can picture it with seedlings are the same thing. Anyone who's grown some seeds before, who's just scattered them in a seed tray, knows that when they come up, they just come up as this thicket. And if you are just to leave them, they all grow thin and spindly and starve the soil really quickly. You've got to prick them out. You've got to take the individuals and you've got to put them somewhere with some fresh soil and some space around them, and they will then grow into the beautiful whatever you're growing. But if you leave them in that crowded place, eventually they'll just wither and die, but they're just crowded. So it's an image that appeals to me because I can see it. I can see examples in my head of it. So, yes, it sounds fascinating.
I think that's a really important, and as you kind of walk through the image even more, it's not only, like you're saying, it's not only those individual trees won't thrive, but the crowding out will make none of them thrive.
Yeah.
And so when I really think about it, even as my work in the past as a psychologist, I can really see that many people that I know and myself at different times, there was so much pruning that needed to be done that nothing could thrive.
Well, I know what I'll be doing this week. I'll be using one of my Audible credits to listen to her book because it sounds really interesting. And like I said, something that I think that I'll find very helpful, especially at the moment. So that's what I'll be doing.
Great. And I'll be working on the app. So at some point, we'll come back together and compare notes on what we're learning about this neurocycle.
We will, yes. It sounds like we're both going to be putting some of it into practice.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope you have, apart from listening to the app, I hope you have a very fabulous week.
You too, Daisy. And everyone out there, have a great week.